Hey gang, John Bacarella here with Sportsman's Direct, and I thought we would do a little video for on drop shot and panfish here, at least about the equipment side of things, the different rigging techniques, different kind of some non-conventional drop shotting techniques as well. So I know I'm talking to a lot of guys out there that probably already do know what drop shot rigging is. And I know I'm talking to a lot of ice fishermen out there too, because I know we got a pretty strong following in the ice fishing community out there. So this video is going to be a little bit about combining those two techniques for open water, and actually not just for open water, but for ice fishing as well. And hopefully I'll do a good job of explaining exactly what I'm talking about. So first I'm going to start out with talking about one of the products that we carry, and that's the drop shot panfish rig. Now this drop shot panfish rig is a little different than your traditional drop shotting rig, whereas normally with a regular drop shot rig you're going to tie that hook up into the main line. So you got all different styles of hooks. We got these gummies, got some spin shots here, owner mosquito hooks. I mean, those are kind of your basic types of drop shot hooks. I mean, they're just a wide bend, short shank hook that's tied into the main line. And normally with drop shotting or conventional drop shotting, you're going to fish a plastic on it, sometimes live bait. But with our drop shot rig, our perch, this is our drop shot panfish rig. I've got it shown here with a couple of soft plastic baits on there, our crappie fry, our custom crappie fries on here. So this is kind of our traditional perch rig out here. Now, unlike your traditional drop shot rig, you can see that these hooks are not fixed. So they're sliding around, they're sliding up and down on this main line. They've got a little crimp here to stop it. We've got a sinker down here. It's not your traditional drop shot sinker, it's just a regular bell sinker. Now, we use these for perch out here on Lake St. Clair. They use them out on Erie. They use them kind of all over the place now, actually. But what makes these rigs kind of special is that since these, obviously they move up and down, right? They slide up and down. So when you're working these baits will float up and down onto on that main line. Especially when a panfish comes in and eats this bait, he's not going to be able to swallow it, because unlike a traditional regular perch rig or crappie rig with a 6-inch snell or 4 or 5-inch leader line on it that the fish can take down its throat, the fish can only take this bait legitimately up to the main line. So he can only take it as long as that hook is. And we use a number 4 Aberdeen on these rigs. So he can only take that shank of the hook down into his throat, which is good for the fish because it means you can release them a lot easier. And it's good for you because it means you're not taking all that time trying to dig that hook out of a fish's throat that swallowed it. Now, we'll use these a lot of times with either a crawler or a live emerald shiner on them as well. But right here, like I've got it shown, we're using some of our custom crappie fries on here. Now, one of the other advantages to this bait is your sense of feel. So all you guys that are drop shot bass fishermen out there, you know that when a fish touches this hook or this bait, you immediately can feel it up your main line as well, right? So there's no loss of sensitivity, no loss of contact with the fish, which means that as soon as you feel that fish, you can set the hook. Unlike a traditional perch rig with a dropper where that fish can swim around down there and move around and play with it before you ever feel him. Now, there's another advantage to this as well, and that's not just when you're using it like in bottom contact with that sinker down on the bottom, but that's also the same case when you're using it with a float. Now, whether it's a float with a spring on it, or whether it's, I prefer to much rather fish with a slip bobber style float. The other advantage is that float's going to react immediately to a fish touching that bait as well. So again, just like with your perch rig, where that fish can swim around down there and mess around with that 6 inches of slack line on that snelled hook, he doesn't have that here. So when that fish touches that bait, this float's going to react to it immediately. The only thing it's not going to react real well to is on a negative bite coming up, because you're sliding with our rig. But if you were to rig with a traditional drop shot rig, you would see that reaction on your float as well. So that's with that slip bobber. I mean, the other advantage is you can fish suspended. So you're not going to necessarily be in contact with the bottom. Matter of fact, it's going to be pretty hard to set that float so that you're perfectly in contact with bottom all the time. So you're going to just use the bare minimum weight that you can to load that bobber up, or that float up, so that it's going to detect that bite, very quickly. So you want to put just the right amount of weight on there so that that float reacts immediately to any change of tension that fish is going to put on these baits. Now, there's also some other things that you can do with this style of rig, okay? So right now we got 2 hooks on here, right? And we've got that small snap end, we've got a sinker, we got a small bell sinker. But you can take that bell sinker off, and now you can add any number of actual baits down there. So if you're fishing with a float, you can add a small jig and wrap on there, one of these Z-Vibes on there. I mean, this one I think is was that the 1/8? Yeah, that's the 1/8 ounce. Probably going to be a little heavy in most cases, but definitely this little tiny 1/16 Z-Viber on here, you could definitely fish with a drop shot rig. Now, depends on your local laws as far as what you're allowed to put on as far as number of hooks. So with this rig, we've already got 2 hooks on here right now. So adding another bait down there on the bottom is going to be adding at least a 3rd hook, again, depending on your regulations and how they view, those different baits. But again, don't forget, you can tie a regular drop shot rig any way you want with whatever drop shot hook you want to put on there. You can set that depth down to your secondary bait down there on the bottom, and it's a really cool rig because you get the advantage of either. You could put a jig down there as well, right? One of the things I don't have out here to show you, which I should have grabbed, is a 6mm tungsten jig that we fish all the time out here with plastics as well. Now with that 6mm tungsten jig on there, you can cast that bait with the float, or you can just cast it and free swim it back in, which a lot of the guys were doing out here. Matter of fact, one of the techniques these guys were really using out here this spring, actually still are right now out here on Lake St. Clair with the perch spawn, is using one of these either 5 or 6 inch rocket bobbers and putting it on there with that big 6mm tungsten. And I mean, they could chuck that rig a long way, and they were catching double headers and sometimes triple headers on the perch out there with that. So now we're talking about, for the most case, we're talking about these slip bobbers and spring bobbers and the rocket bobbers. This case here is like a traditional steelhead style bobber, where you're going to have your silicone tubing up at the top and the bottom. Let's talk a little bit about the different presentations that you're going to get depending on the style of bobber that you use. And a lot of guys don't consider this at all. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about what happens down on the business end, down at your line, depending on the style of bobber that you're using. So let's talk real quick about slip bobbers, since I said I like to use slip bobbers. Now, the slip bobber is going to give you a more vertical presentation with your bait, regardless of how far you cast it or how close you fish it to where you're standing. Okay, so if you think about it this way, your line is going to slide vertical up and down through this slip bobber. It's going to your line's going to pull through. It's going to hit the bobber stop. When you pull on when you work that bait, or when you pull on that bobber, you're going to pull your bait vertically. So you have to think about that with what you've got down there on the business end and what it's actually doing, if you can envision that. So even though your bobber is going to pull towards you, it's also going to pull towards you, and that bait's going to rise up and down. And as you drop the line back in on slack, that bait's going to drop straight back down vertical. So you're going to be kind of limited in the action that you're going to put down there on that bait. Now, if you're fishing something like this little Z-Viber down there, or you're fishing like this jig and wrap, you just got to bear in mind what that bait is doing as you're working that bait. So that's going to be more of a vertical presentation with some horizontal movement to that bait as well. Unlike if you were to use this standard spring style. Now, I use this style bobber all the time, although I will take that spring off, and I'll usually put surgical tubing, and most of you guys that are steelheaders out there know what I'm talking about. We'll put silicone or surgical tubing down here, and we'll take that bobber off, or that, I should say, we'll take that spring off down there and replace it with that tubing so so the spring doesn't damage the line. That surgical tubing on there will not damage or kink your line, so it kind of protects it. But the point that I want to make about using this is it's going to be a totally different action down there on the business end, whether you're using a drop shot rig or whether you're using anything down there for that matter, is that when you work this bait and you pull it, and that goes for, actually for the steelhead style as well, because your hook or your line is going to be fixed down at that bottom of the float. When you pull that line is going to move, or that float is going to move horizontally. Your line is going to come up, so that bait is going to come up, and then when you stop pulling it, that bait's going to swing down. So you're going to get this constant pendulum action where that bait is riding up and then it's swimming down. It's riding up and it's swimming down. And quite honestly, that's one of my favorite ways to fish. So a lot of times if I'm not fishing live bait, I'm not going to be using that slip bobber. If I'm fishing something that's going to be active, like any of these plastics here, I'm gonna be using something where I'm gonna peg that main line down at the bottom of these floats. Now, with that in mind, if you're gonna be fishing, you know, whatever depth of water you're gonna fish, you're gonna have to pay attention to what rod you're gonna use if you're gonna throw a rig like this, because you got to remember you're gonna have whatever depth you're fishing. So say you're fishing 8 feet of water and you're trying to fish, you know, the entire water column, and you're trying to set your drop shot rig or your bait down to get it close to the bottom, which a lot of times is where the perch are, although definitely they will suspend and they will go much higher in the water column when they're, you know, when the bite is on. But point being, if I'm fishing 8 feet of water, I'm probably going to be chucking out close to 8 feet of line below that float, which means I'm going to need a rod that's going to be capable to pick up that 8 feet of line below the float and cast it efficiently. So generally you're going to have a longer rod. I guess, long story short, you're going to have a longer rod to do that. When you're fishing with a regular slip bobber, you can get away with using a much shorter rod to throw that slip bobber out there, because you're going to be reeling that line all the way up into your rod. So you got to kind of match everything. You know, it's a system, so your rod's going to have to match the setup that you're using for presentation most of the time, especially if you're casting. If you're just chucking off of a dock or you're out in the boat, it's a little different. You know, it may not be that critical as far as the type of, the length of the rod that you're using and the action. For as far as action goes for panfish, I like a medium light action to light action rod. I don't do the super ultralight thing anymore. I like to get the hook sets. Out here on St. Clair, we got a lot of smallies, and I like to have a little bit more backbone to play these smallies out here, and the big perch and crappies and even the giant groupers that we get out here as well, which are rock bass for you guys if you haven't heard me talk about groupers before. What else are we going to talk about here? I guess types of plastics to use. These roadside minnows, these 1.75 nano fries are a good choice out here. It's when you're going after bigger fish and you want to just go upscale a little bit, you want a little bigger bait down there, these guys work pretty good. They've also got a smaller one that we'll use out here. This is the 1-inch nano fry. This is another great bait out here, but this one you're going to want to pair up with a smaller hook, especially smaller than what we would generally use on our drop shot panfish rig. One of the classic baits that's at least used around here are these panfish assassins. These are the tiny shad, 1.5 inch, and we've got a ton of these colors on our website, but this is definitely an all-time favorite around here for fishing, whether it's on drop shot rigs, fishing them on our 6mm tungstens, or guys just fishing them on regular lead jig heads. I mean, pretty much year-round we use these out here. And then, like I was talking about our crappie fries, all these little guys that we custom paint, These are about 1.5 inch bait as well. And that seems to be a really good size for this application, about 1 inch to 1.5 inches, and you can go up to as much as 2 inches. You just want to make sure you match your hook size with that bait that you're using, so that you've got enough of that, you don't have too much shank, and that you've got enough of that hook protruding up and through the back of the plastics. Now, you can really use just about anything. So again, I know a lot of you guys are ice fishermen. You heard me talk about 6mm tungstens. You definitely can use other size tungsten as well down on the bottom of that drop shot rig. For that matter, you can use all different types of different plastics up there on the top. Matter of fact, you can even tie in a fly if you want. We tend to call that a Michigan rig here. And back when I used to do the tournament circuit, the guys down down by Brooklyn, down in the Jackson area, turned me on to that technique. And it's really just a drop shot rig. It's using a regular jig down on the bottom, like a 3 or 4 mil tungsten jig down on the bottom, and then you tie a fly in up on the top, just like you would one of these drop shot hooks. And there's no reason why you couldn't do the same thing out here, you know, for panfish during the open water season. And for you walleye guys, same thing goes for you, okay? Now, out here in the Detroit and St. Clair rivers, we've got a lot of current, so we got a lot of heavy current. So if you're out in that main current, it's going to be pretty tough to fish a jig and then another a big soft plastic like what these fish, you know, like to eat, you know, 3.5, 4 inch plastic like we're normally used to using. But there's no reason why in the more slack currents, the shallower water where there's not as much velocity in there and drag on your line, on your rig, that you couldn't use a heavier jig head down on the bottom, go up a few inches and tie in, you could tie in a Wyandotte worm up there on a drop shot rig. You could tie in another finesse, you could tie in another type of bait up there as well. So, you know, just kind of a hint, guys, there's more than one way to skin a cat, and with these rigs like this, I want to get you thinking out of the box. Not just with the floats, but with, you know, drop shotting in general. There's just a lot of opportunities to fish the drop shot rig for panfish. You could fish crappies, you can fish perch, you can fish smallmouth. I mean, it's kind of the sky's the limit. And you know, this little pre-tied rig that we sell for you guys that are panfish fishing, especially for live bait, is perfect. And it's a very versatile tool out there. So I hope and I just you know, broaden your perspective on different ways to fish. I know these guys out here were just tried and true emerald shiner fishermen, and we tried to get them to use plastics, and it wasn't actually until the coronavirus thing kind of kicked in here that it got a little tough for them to get live bait here, and it did last year as well too in the fall. We just could not get emerald shiners for pretty much for the middle part of the summer all the way through the fall. So a lot of these guys were forced to fish plastics, and I think a lot of them now, I mean, some of them may never go back to fishing live bait. Maybe that's a little too strong, but at least they know they've got options, okay? And they've got options that'll produce quality fish, and that's exactly what drop shot rigging for panfish will do. And I hope I gave you some tips on effective ways to do it. Hey, if you like this video content and you want to get updated as soon as the next video is out there, hit that subscribe button and the little bell icon, and you'll get notified as soon as the next video is up.